Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're going to give it a minute here for everybody to file in. We had quite a few people register for today's webinar. So we'll give it maybe about 30 to 40 more seconds before we get started. Okay, see if folks are still filing in. I'm going to wait just a few more seconds. Okay. Why don't we get started? I'm sure there'll be some additional folks filing in here. Welcome to this fifth and final installment of our Corporate Responsibility to Respect, or CR2R for short, webinar series. This webinar today will explore the topic of effective operational level grievance mechanisms. My name is Rebecca DeWinter-Schmidt, and I am Associate Director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. We are a collective action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. We're a membership-based initiative focusing on the investor responsibility to respect human rights, corporate engagements that drive responsible business conduct, and standard-setting activities that push for robust business and human rights policies. Before we get started, I also like to thank Asaba Hawk, who's in the background helping to run this webinar. And I will introduce our speakers here in a second, but just a few logistical matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website and YouTube channel, and I will put in the chat here a second our YouTube channel. You are on mute to improve the sound quality. You can ask questions, however. The chat function is disabled, but you can pose questions in the Q&A and feel free to do so throughout the webinar. It would be great when you pose a question if you could say what your name is, if it's not already apparent, and your organizational affiliation. So if we go on to the next slide. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we're going to cover today and who is covering what. So first up, and maybe even Asaba, we could go one slide further so folks can identify speakers with faces. So first up, we're going to hear from Jonathan Drimmer, who's a partner at Steptoe and a senior advisor at the Global Business Initiative. Jonathan has many other roles, but I unfortunately do not have time to go through this wonderful bios of everyone who's participating today. But he's going to share with us information about what company good practices for effective operational level grievance mechanisms look like. And in fact, he has recently developed for the Global Business Initiative a guidance called What Good Looks Like, Grievance Mechanisms and Remedy, as well as a very useful assessment template with indicators, tests, and evidence for folks to evaluate grievance mechanisms. I'm going to be calling out a few resources here during the introductions. I'm going to put a link to our event website here in a second, and that's where all the resources are located, so you can look those up directly. Then next, we're going to hear from Namit Agarwal, Head of Social at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and he's going to walk us through the process and indicators that the WBA uses for both its social benchmark as well as its deep dive corporate human rights benchmark, which are used to assess companies' performance on grievance mechanisms, remedy, and stakeholder engagement. Then we're going to hear from Michael Courtenay, who is Investigations Manager in the Legal Ethics and Compliance team at Lenovo. And he's going to provide us a very concrete example of a grievance mechanism in practice. And he's going to walk us through Lenovo's journey to develop its grievance processes. And then last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Mary Beth Gallagher, and she is Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments. And she's going to share with us an investor perspective on engaging companies on the effectiveness of their grievance mechanisms. And she is co-author of a recent guide, Investor Expectations on Grievance and Remedy, Key Insights and Recommendations, which makes the business case for companies to have remedy readiness in place to address problems that arise and to also help inform investor stewardship activities. Again, I'll put the link to our event web page here in the chat in a second. You can look up all these resources. Asaba, if we just go another slide further, or I guess 2 slides actually. So just briefly, so this webinar series, as I said, this is the final installment. It is meant to systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as framed in the UN Guiding Principles, to educate investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. Obviously, investors, and many of you are investors in the audience today, are our target audience, as we're hoping that you can use the information gleaned from these webinars in your engagements. Certainly, we are doing so for our corporate human rights benchmark engagement. And if that is something you're interested in, please do feel free to reach out to myself or to Asaba. But this should also be valuable to portfolio companies that need to disclose to investors their human rights commitments and performance, as well as civil society organizations and other stakeholders seeking to hold companies and investors to account for their human rights commitments. So very, very briefly, so we do want to move on to our speakers. Let me just maybe center ourselves here in terms of what we're talking about today. Asaba, if we can move on to the next slide. CR2R, the handy dandy abbreviation for corporate responsibility respect, entails three things as laid out in UNGP 15. It's namely a policy commitment to respect human rights, a human rights due diligence process to identify, seize, prevent, mitigate, and account for how companies are addressing their human rights impacts, and then thirdly, processes to remediate adverse impacts. As you can see here, we have done deep dive webinars on each step in this process. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see here this OECD due diligence guidance diagram. We're diving deep into step 6 here, remediation when appropriate in the case of identified harms. UNGP 22 really serves as a kind of bridge between the corporate responsibility respect and this idea of remediation, because it establishes that when businesses identify that they have caused or contributed to adverse impacts, that they are responsible for either providing or contributing to the remediation through legitimate processes. And then specifically, UNGP 29 states that to make it possible for grievances to be addressed early and remediated directly, business enterprises should establish or participate in effective operational level grievance mechanisms. I'm going to say in a second what we mean with effective, and we're going to hear a lot about that today, both for individuals and communities who have been adversely impacted. Why is this important? Obviously, it allows for those impacted to raise concerns where harms have occurred and to receive remedy that will hopefully, as far as possible, restore them to where they were before the harm occurred. It enables companies to identify systemic problems and address harms before they compound and grievances potentially escalate, so they serve as an early warning mechanism. And then for investors, importantly, transparent reporting and grievance mechanisms and actions taken to address harms are supportive of investors' own due diligence efforts and inform investment decision-making, as well as reinforcing accountability for human rights commitments. So just very briefly, and I don't have time to go into this deeply, but if we go to the next slide, you'll see here what the effectiveness criteria are for grievance mechanisms. I think one thing we should always bear in mind that's very important is that grievance mechanisms should be user-centric, right? They should be developed with the input of stakeholders. We should ensure that those who are meant to use them can actually effectively use them. They understand the processes. There are no barriers to use. And that when companies do seek to remediate, that they're also ensuring that the kind of remedies offered reflect the needs of those who have been harmed. But we're going to go into all of this in a lot more detail with our speakers. This chart, by the way, comes from another resource on the webpage by the British International Investment in 2050, tips on effective grievance mechanisms for business. But on that note, talking about what good looks like, I'd like to hand it over to Jonathan Drimmer and thank Jonathan for being here today. Over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks for having me. So I really wanted to talk a little bit about, really some of the basics for grievance mechanisms, in addition to, what the UNGPs necessarily say. What do they really mean? How are they really used? And what are some of the challenges that companies often have on the practical implementation of grievance mechanisms? And I really want to start with just the most basic concept, and that is a grievance mechanism really is a pathway for somebody to raise a concern. When Professor Ruggie began his work on the guiding principles at the beginning of his appointment as special representative, the idea of external company grievance mechanisms, it really wasn't widely discussed. Only a few companies had them, but he and his team recognized that serious human rights abuses often begin with small issues. When they aren't addressed, tensions grow, those lead to significant human rights problems. And he and his team, Professor Ruggie and his team, came to recognize that grievance mechanisms really are a fundamental part of a corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and that is why they have such a pronounced appearance in the UN guiding principles, primarily in Pillar 3. But they are important. Grievance mechanisms are important for companies for a few reasons. First, they are a method of engaging with stakeholders. They are a stakeholder engagement tool, whether that's employees or community members or community representatives or others, and they help build trust and confidence, and they reinforce a company's social license to operate. Second, they can also serve as an early warning sign. Even when human rights issues per se aren't being raised through grievance mechanisms, this is a structured way to raise any kind of a concern for affected stakeholders at the time they arise. And consistent with how this journey for Professor Recchi began, they prevent small issues from becoming big issues. Third, and I do think this is, when we think about grievance mechanisms, it's often the primary reason. These do allow companies to identify potential and actual human rights impacts. They allow affected stakeholders to seek a direct avenue of a remedy from companies. And that's really what we generally think about when we do talk about right to remedy. We think about why grievance mechanisms are generally looked at today. But finally, they also help companies identify potential patterns and trends and improve their performance and improve policies, procedures, training, stakeholder engagement, and other techniques, community engagement projects, so that they ultimately can be more effective partners with local communities and with those that are impacted by their operations. Increasingly with the guiding principles generally, and this is going to be true of grievance mechanisms, which are generally contemplated as complaint and notification systems in legislation, the UNGPs generally, grievance mechanisms specifically, are increasingly being incorporated into different kinds of laws. So the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act includes something that is akin to a grievance mechanism element. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, CSRD, these include grievance mechanism requirements, and they also appear in some of the proposed human rights due diligence legislation that's coming up recently, like South Korea is contemplating with its mandatory human rights due diligence law. But it's important to remember that how these are ultimately described and discussed in legislation and proposed legislation, it is different than the UN guiding principles. It's often a subset. When we think of the effectiveness criteria of the guiding principles, that subset is really what ends up being included within legislation. And part of that has to do with the difficulty in transposing the UN guiding principles into law. And part of it has to do with looking to align with existing reporting systems as well as some regulations like the EU whistleblower regulation. But when we do think about good human rights practice and UNGP alignment, it goes beyond what legislation ultimately demands. A couple of issues, though, I do want to emphasize from experience. And again, I've been independent monitor for 4 different grievance mechanisms in the course of my career. I want to tell you a little bit about what I've seen, both from my counseling as a lawyer, as well as from my independent monitor work. And one area that is consistently overlooked and not fully utilized is feedback. And often companies, as part of best practice, will do community engagement and potential affected stakeholder engagement at the outset in grievance mechanism design. And that's really important in understanding potential barriers and pathways to report and the kinds of issues that will arise, and therefore the expertise you ultimately might want internally. But that feedback should be ongoing. And often companies aren't really thinking about OGM feedback from the most important stakeholders, those that are using it, as ways to improve their systems. And again, this can help address barriers. It can help address challenge. It can create new pathways for reporting, things like that. So for instance, you might have a number of different pathways, a hotline, an email Dropbox, things like that. But if claimants have intermittent Wi-Fi or they can't read or write or they don't have cell phones, those kinds of mechanisms for reporting don't really work. And so that is where feedback can ultimately be so helpful. Another one I want to mention is how the information from grievance mechanisms is ultimately used. And too often, companies aren't really mining the information that comes in and the patterns and trends for programmatic improvements. And again, this is a fundamental benefit that can be provided from grievance mechanisms. And it is one that companies often aren't looking at that data and yielding enough that ultimately comes out of it. But the final thing I'll mention, this is important. Rebecca did mention that I did, as part of my independent monitor work, come up with a series of indicators, a number of different tests that can ultimately be applied that is available publicly. It's available. Rebecca has made it available in addition to some other resources that we've contributed to. But one of the things that I've really learned, and I do want to emphasize this when we do talk about grievance mechanisms, when you look at the indicators, the number of indicators and sub-indicators and all of that, at its core, effective grievance mechanisms have to have three relevant elements. First, claimants have to be comfortable lodging and grievances, and they have to be relatively easy to lodge. Second, the grievances should be addressed by the OGM in a constructive manner. And third, negative impacts are remediated that are reported, they're remediated through a human rights compatible approach. And if they have those three basic things, the OGM itself is effective. All of the additional indicators, all of the additional bells and whistles that we put into it, these are ways that OGMs can be improved, and over time they should continually be improved. There is no resting point of perfection. It is a process of continual improvement. But when we do think about on the concept of the effectiveness criteria, these are guidelines and guideposts. And just because an OGM doesn't necessarily meet every single element of the effectiveness criteria doesn't mean that it isn't effective. So I'll stop there and just note, I do think that when my final point, when we do think about OGMs and we think about proposed legislation, and obviously the memorialization of human rights principles and legislation is really where we are going, human rights related regulation. I still think that grievance mechanisms are maybe the most important part for companies. And the reason is when people have concerns, they have problems, the kinds of issues that lead to complaints to regulators, complaints that are looked to be resolved through civil litigation, they'll often come to the companies first. And how the company processes that concern when it's raised will often then dictate, am I going to end up in a regulatory investigation? Am I going to end up in a lawsuit? So I do think as the early warning sign and the place where concerns can initially be lodged, these are critical for companies to avoid the kind of significant company-specific problems, not just human rights problems, but company-specific problems that everybody is looking to avoid. Let me stop with that, Rebecca, if I could, and hand it back to you. And of course, happy to take questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And folks, just want to remind you, if you do have questions for Jonathan or the speakers, do feel free to put that in the Q&A. And thank you, really useful, Jonathan, to get that insight from your firsthand experiences as an independent monitor. I put the link to the assessment template in the chat, and it's a really useful tool. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Namit. I believe, Namit, you have some slides that you are going to be sharing with us to walk us through. Thanks, Namit, for being
Thanks.
here.
Thanks, Rebecca, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I think it's a good segue from what John already presented, and I'll be sharing some slides with data on what we have found from our benchmarks. And before I get into the data and insights, I wanted to give you an overview of what WBA is. Some of you might be familiar, but we assess the world's most influential 2,000 companies, which are across 83 countries, very, very well represented kind of geographic sample. And these companies have revenues equivalent to almost half of global GDP. So really influential companies that we assess. And we assess them because we believe that without business transformation, there is no way for us to achieve a stable and sustainable future. We are a nonprofit, so all our assessments or methodologies are available freely on our website with the aim and objective of driving corporate accountability through, of course, investors, civil society organizations, as well as regulators. And we work through an alliance of more than 400 global organizations. And we take a tiered approach of assessing companies on various topics, including social, which is the topic that I lead in WBA. And within social, we have a focus on human rights assessment. And we have two benchmarks. One is the social benchmark, which looks at all 2,000 companies in the scope of WBA. And we assess particularly on grievance mechanisms, on the baseline expectations on what as an investor, you could use for portfolio-wide screening. And then we also have the corporate human rights benchmark where we assess more in-depth, but a smaller sample, about 100 companies in 5 high-risk sectors. And these are companies who are more mature in their journey of implementing and adopting human rights. And this, from an investor's perspective, will provide more deep due diligence insights on grievance and remedy, looking at quality, effectiveness, and remedy outcomes. Let me start with what we found from our 2024 social benchmark assessment, where we looked at all of these 2,000 companies, and roughly about half of these companies have a grievance mechanism or have a disclosure on having a grievance mechanism available to their workers or their external individuals. But we wanted to look at what is the correlation between engagement with affected and potentially affected stakeholders and companies having these mechanisms in place. And only 9% of these 2,000 companies disclose examples of how they have engaged with these affected stakeholders across their human rights processes. So when we looked at this correlation, we found that more than 70% of the companies that have had affected stakeholders' engagement have a grievance mechanism in place, whereas the companies that did not have an engagement in place, only 44% of those companies have these grievance mechanisms. So this is quite relevant and also linked to what Jonathan was talking about in terms of engagement with stakeholders, which is kind of the cornerstone for an effective grievance mechanism. Now let's go deeper and look at what are these 100 companies from the corporate human rights benchmark doing. And this is data and trends from the last 7 years of our assessment of the CHRB companies, and where we have definitely seen improvement on the grievance mechanism indicator, where access to these mechanisms has improved over a number of years, where companies that are committing to provide remedy increased from 16% to 30%. Access to supply chain workers, communities, and external individuals has also increased by 20-25%. And these mechanisms are available in local languages, indicating that there is more accessibility. And these are also, there are elements to suggest that it's becoming more rights compatible, where companies are describing how they provide remedy or how they have done so. So these are all the measurement areas from the CHRB, and approximately a 5% increase over the last 7 years or 5 iterations. But that is half the story. Effectiveness still lags behind the availability. Yes, grievance mechanisms are more legitimate, accessible, but they're not predictable, they are not equitable, and they're not transparent. And that is where, when rubber hits the road, we see the gaps there. These mechanisms are largely weak on transparency and predictability, very limited stakeholder engagement, and equity challenges still remain, where on the point of community access to grievance mechanism through suppliers has not improved in these years. And then we have also seen the transparency of these mechanisms actually declining over time, which is quite a red flag when it comes to looking at what companies are learning and whether the mechanisms are effective to give them an early signal for the kind of risks and impacts they might see in the near future. So now getting into the indicators and what we are measuring, and this is indicators from the upcoming data, which will be available in January, around the mid-January, when all of this data will be available across all 2,000 companies and for 100 companies in CHRB. In the social benchmark, we have two relevant indicators. One's that looks at grievance mechanism for workers, whether company has one or more grievance mechanisms, whether these are accessible to all workers, and can workers use it without fear of reprisals. And the other indicator looks at the community side of it and external individuals, whether these mechanisms are available to affected, potentially affected individuals and communities, and whether there is an explicit protection from retaliation. And these indicators, because these are industry agnostic and look at all 2,000 companies in scope, this is more of setting the floor for grievance and remedy expectations. And we believe that investors using these indicators and data can get at scale a clear signal of whether companies meet the minimum UNGP expectations. This will also give you comparable data across 2,000 companies, and in many cases, portfolio level visibility on access to grievance channels for these companies. Going through the CHRB indicators, we have much more depth. We have a measurement area on remedies and grievance mechanisms, where we look at mechanisms for workers, mechanisms for external individuals and communities, and whether these procedures are fair and transparent, and what elements exist to make sure that these also look at remedying adverse human rights impact. So I'll take you briefly through all these four indicators. So the first one is where we look at whether a company has one or more grievance mechanisms, or they participate in a shared industry sector level mechanism, and whether these are accessible to all workers. Also looking at whether the mechanism is available in appropriate languages, and is it communicated to workers through trainings or other means. We believe this will tell investors whether workers can raise concerns safely and practically, whether these mechanisms are embedded in everyday operations so that it is not just a political commitment, but there are mechanisms to operationalize as well. The next one, which looks at external individuals and communities, we expect companies to have these mechanisms available, and making sure that, again, these are available in local languages, and there is enough awareness among communities, affected communities, and potentially affected communities at the company operational sites. And this can inform investors whether companies recognize these impacts beyond their workforce into their supply chains and communities. The next one is making sure that these procedures are fair, transparent, and usable. And we look for companies explaining in their public disclosures how they handle these grievances, whether the timelines are clear for addressing complaints, what is the process of keeping the complainants informed, what kind of technical, financial, or advisory support is made available to complainants, what kind of outcomes can complainants realistically expect, and what kind of escalation pathways exist if the complainants are not satisfied with some of these. And we believe this will help investors to make sure that the mechanisms are credible and trusted, and align with the UNGP effectiveness criteria. The last one is looking at the remedy aspect, and we assess companies on whether it describes how it provides or enables timely remedy, explains what it would do if no impacts have been identified, and whether they disclose what changes they have brought about in their systems, management systems, and practices based on what they have learned. And this can inform investors whether companies move beyond just handling complaints to fix the root causes of some of these grievances. Leaving you with two leading practices from past assessments, one from Wilmar, another one from Samsung. Wilmar's grievance mechanisms are accessible to both their own workers and supply chain workers, but also to external individuals and communities. Their disclosures are transparent. The grievance mechanisms are transparent, have a specific mention of response timelines. They also explain how the remedy is provided, what is the system to prevent recurrence. Samsung has been a consistent, strong performer on the accessibility part across the CHRB iterations. They focus on their disclosures on improving predictability, rights compatibility, and they also explain ways in which they maintain stakeholder engagement, and maintaining ongoing dialogue and feedback as a learning process. I know there was a lot of data in there. I'm leaving my email address so that if you have any questions now or later, I'll be happy to answer. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Namit, and thank you for offering your email address. And that is some dense information, but just want to note, as I said, well, first of all, we're very much looking forward to the data release in January, both from the social benchmark and the CHRB. For those who are interested in the CHRB engagement that we will be conducting, we work closely with Namit and his team, and we will be having as one of our 4 engagement things, grievance mechanisms and remedies. So a chance to learn more. We're doing some skills building around that, and yes, I'm shamelessly making a plug for that. But while we're on the topic of company good practices and companies' journey in terms of putting in place grievance mechanisms, I'm going to hand things over to Mike Courtney at Lenovo. And Mike, thanks again for being here today, and looking forward to hearing from you as well.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for having me here. So today I'll talk about our grievance mechanism and our remediation process that we have at Lenovo. If we go to the next slide, please. And so what I'm going to cover off on, I'll give an introduction on where our grievance mechanism sits within Lenovo, our overall investigation process, and then from our user side of things, so our whistleblowing and our case management system, and how we conduct those investigations and handle those grievances that are raised. I'll then also cover off a bit on our speaker program, where we're constantly driving to get the awareness out there so we can receive more and more concerns from our employees and from external partners. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with our grievance mechanism, it sits within my team in legal. So within legal, I conducted legal investigations across the organization with my team, but we also manage the grievance mechanism, our case management system, and our reporting hotline. And I report up to our Director of Legal Counsel, Global Ethics and Compliance, who then reports up to our VP of Deputy General Counsel, Ethics and Compliance, Government Relations and Trade. And that's where our grievance mechanism sits within Lenovo. Next slide, please. So I'll cover off now on Lenovo's investigation process and how we handle our investigations globally. So Lenovo has an investigation oversight committee, and this is made up of 6 different functions. So we have employee relations, legal, ICIC, which is the Independent Commission Against Corruption in China. We have internal audit, security, which is our corporate security and physical security, and we have our CISO team, which are our IT teams. Now, the IOC is responsible for full oversight of all concerns that are raised to the company and all investigations that get conducted. We set and administer the global investigations policy and framework, and we have a whistleblowing policy as well that we follow along, and also makes aware to our employees and to any external partners who want to raise concerns how the whistleblowing complaint will be handled. We manage the reports through a central case management system, which I will cover off in the next few slides. And on a monthly basis, we meet together, the function leads for the IOC, to discuss any trends we're seeing, any notable cases, outcomes, what we can do to address certain areas or identify particular training or focuses and increase awarenesses. So particularly, for example, if we're seeing in one location, we're getting a certain number of complaints that were expected as per our benchmark, but then we're seeing in another location where we've got employee numbers about the same, we're not reaching those numbers. We then look at why, and then we go out and target those specific locations to see what's the reason we're not hearing anything. At Lenovo, if we're not hearing anything in a location, it doesn't mean everything is perfect or working fine. It means we're not hearing about it. So we want to understand why. Is it because they don't know how to raise a concern, or they're not comfortable raising a concern, or they don't feel confident? And we address that. And I'll cover off on some of that as well. And then we provide our reports and our stats on the cases we've handled, the outcomes of those cases. We report them regularly to our board and committee as well. Next slide, please. So how we receive our grievances, we receive them through a lot of methods, and we have a lot of channels available in our whistleblowing. We have our Lenovo line, which is linked to our case management system. And so that's the main tool we push for people to raise concerns through. On the Lenovo line, which I'll cover off on, they can raise it through web link, through a telephone number, through a mobile phone app. But in the whistleblowing policy, it also provides an email address they can contact. They can contact their manager, employee relations. There's several mechanisms that they can go to raise concerns. Regardless of how we receive the complaint, we log it onto our case management system. So everything is captured there. So we can identify trends, risks, and we can also address the issues clearly. And so everything's handled in a consistent manner. All cases, regardless how they come through, will be assessed, and they'll be funneled through the IOC and accepted for investigation. And then that's when we hand it out to particular functions. Depending on the type of matter, we'll determine which function it goes to. Next slide, please. So here's an example. This is our investigations matrix. So when a case comes in, we assess it, we triage it, and based on which category it fits into, we'll go to one of these functions. So I'm in the legal department. So if a human rights case came in, it would fall to us within legal and we would conduct it. There's some crossover here. You can see bribery and corruption is under legal, and bribery and corruption is also under internal audit. So the way that would work is if a bribery and corruption allegation came in and it involved government entities or government officials, we would investigate it in legal. If it was more internal and there was no government involvement, it would go to internal audit. We also have some diversions from this. So if a sexual harassment case or an inappropriate conduct case came in against employee relations or someone connected to employee relations, we wouldn't have them investigate their own function. So we would take that in legal, or a different function would take it on. And then in some cases, depending on the circumstances, we might engage outside counsel to conduct the investigation on our behalf. And that could be something where we don't want there to be a perceived conflict of interest or perceived bias in the investigation. So we'll get a fully independent party, such as outside counsel, to conduct that investigation. Or if the reporter or the person raising it is not comfortable for us internally to investigate it, we'll normally engage with outside counsel as well. As you can see here, we do a whole range of matters, everything from inappropriate conduct in the workplace all the way up to bribery, corruption, embezzlement, human rights issue, AI, anything you can think of, we investigate and we accept allegations for all of them. Next slide, please. So how our investigation process works from end to end, the allegation is received through any one of those channels that the reporter can raise it. We assess it, we open it on the system. We then provide an IOC notification to the Investigation Oversight Committee, letting them know this case has come in and it's for internal audit, or it's recommended for legal team or employee relations and so on. We then move to the investigation stage. Usually the first point of contact is the reporter. Even if they're anonymous, we will reach out to them, and I'll explain how we do that through our system. But the first point of contact is reaching out to the reporter to let them know we've got your case, to get more details from them, but also to explain to them the process and what's expected. So they have an idea how long it might take, what might be involved in it, and what the possible outcomes are. And we cover off on the possible outcomes that could come from any investigation. For us here, it's generally either substantiated, unsubstantiated, or unsubstantiated process issues. And then we explain in a bit of detail what each of those means and what would happen outside of them. Once the investigation is complete, so all interviews are conducted, all material has been reviewed, we then move on to our report writing stage, and we'll write a final investigation report, which will include all our findings and based on the evidence during the investigation, and that will then go to the IOC for review. Our function lead in the IOC will then review that report and endorse it, or come back and say, oh, we need additional information here, or I think you should talk to this person. Once it's endorsed, that's when the case is ready for close. And then when we close out, we reach out to all parties involved. So we would reach out to the implicated person, if there are any, and let them know whether it was substantiated, unsubstantiated, and why, and then we would remediate any of those issues. So if it's substantiated, we would then look at implementing discipline or actions to change that. If it's unsubstantiated and process issues identified, we would look at what process issues need to be addressed here. So even though there was no misconduct, there was some type of gap or failure that caused this to happen or caused these people to be concerned. How do we fix that? And we would address that and put those in place. And then for the reporter, we would meet with the reporter and let them know the outcome. And we would let them know why that was the outcome. So if they raised something that was unsubstantiated, we would let them know why it was unsubstantiated, because we want the reporters to go away feeling that even though it was unsubstantiated, they did the right thing by raising it and it was looked at properly. We want them to understand that their grievance was heard. We did look at it, but these were the findings. And if it's substantiated, we will also explain to them why it was substantiated and what was found. We generally won't go into details of what discipline occurred against somebody because that's personal to them, but we would let them know that, certain actions have happened and appropriate action has been taken. If there were process issues identified, we would let them know those process issues as well and what we're doing to address it to avoid these coming up in the future. Next slide, please. So I'll focus a bit on the tool for our users now. So our employees, our external partners, customers, anybody raising a grievance mechanism. So our investigation case management system is created by a third party called Wisply. Now we manage it internally. So we build it out, we build our workflows, we receive all the intake and the reports. We have it available in all languages supporting our employees. So our employees globally speak 42 languages, and we have the grievance mechanism available in all those languages. It's available via desktop, phone, or mobile app for those employees. And they also have the additional ones where they can send us a letter, they can raise it to a manager or an employee person. But for our main tool, they can use a mobile phone, a phone number, a local phone number, or the desktop version. It will switch to their language that they've got set on their computer, or they can manually change it as well. They can remain completely anonymous when they raise a case with us. There's a chat feature in there. They can communicate back and forth with us in their own language. If they send it to me in Spanish, I'll see it in English, I'll respond in English, and they'll receive my response in Spanish. We can continue to communicate with them throughout the whole case without ever knowing who they are. We have no way to identify them unless they tell us who they are. And Wisply themselves also have no way to identify them. We also have instructions on the page explaining that, explaining how their anonymity works and how it's kept, and how if they want to remain anonymous, we will never be able to identify them. The system allows us to collect full data and dashboards on all our cases, so we can look at trends. We look at what's working in our program and how they're becoming aware of it. And with our system as well, we try to comply with all local regulations. So we have data in the EU for our rest of the world, and we have data in China for our China cases. And that's to ensure we comply with the EU whistleblowing directive and also on the PIPL legislation in China. And next slide, please. So I'll focus a bit on our speaker program and how we get this awareness out there. Okay, so we have posters in all of our locations. They're in all the languages, whatever's in that location. So if the location has 3 languages, that poster will be available in 3 languages. It has a QR code, which they can easily use their mobile phone to scan and take them straight to the website. Now, it's not as simple as just having the posters, because in our manufacturing plants, we will have posters up, but then you've got the added hindrance of employees can't take their mobile phone onto the plant floor. So how are they going to do that? So we look at those locations and we make sure the posters are in a location where they can see it, they can raise concerns. It's not under a camera, so they don't feel like they're being watched. It's in somewhere like that they're going to be like a lunchroom where they can easily access it. But in addition to that, they might not feel comfortable taking their phone out and scanning a grievance poster in front of people. So we also did things such as inserts, which go into the back of their cards. We also have pens that roll out. So if they're taking it home, they can do it when they get home and raise it. And we reach out to locations where we have low numbers to see why they're not raising concerns, and we target that. When people raise a concern, we also find out how they heard about the Lenovo line. So we can see, for example, in China, the posters are very popular. That's how people hear about it. But in locations like Hungary, it's more HRs raising the concerns with them. We also do additional targeted training. We do communications going out. So every quarter we send out a comms that highlights some cases that are completely de-identified, but shows people what cases were raised, what was done in an investigation, and what actions were taken, to make it clear to people we do listen and we do take action and we do remediate the process. And we do on-site visits. And then we also do things like targeted comms, but also screen locks and other additional information and training around our locations. We can go to the next one, please. Sorry, I was just aware of timing. That's it. Any questions, please feel free to add any at the end. Thank you very much for having Lenovo here.
Thanks, Mike. That was a really depthful look into how your processes work. Really appreciate that. I'm going to hand over, just given the time, directly to Mary Beth. We also have a few minutes left to answer some of the questions that are coming in the QA. Mary Beth, thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. So good to be here. I'm Mary Beth. I'm the Director of Engagement at Domini Impact Investments. So I'm going to speak a little bit about how we use our role and leverage as investors to engage on the topic of remedying grievance mechanisms. First, I'll start with kind of why we do this, what the investor rationale is, then that concept Rebecca mentioned of remedy readiness, and finally, I'll turn to our expectations of companies and good practices for disclosure that we're really seeking. Mike, thank you for your work. I'll just say that we've engaged with Lenovo and really have seen the practices you've just described as leading. And for the most part, in my years of engaging with companies, talking about grievance mechanism and remedy has been among the most challenging. Companies will often say at the end of a dialogue, yes, we have an ethics hotline, or we work with this third party, but you don't really get a sense of the fact that that grievance channel and remedy is integrated into their human rights due diligence. So I'll talk a little bit about why we think it's important to address that. With another investor at Amundi, we've been working over the past 3 years to try to increase our capacity as investors to situate this conversation more effectively so that we can learn from people like Mike inside companies about why they have grievance channels, how they're being leveraged. We're not well positioned to seek justice for past harms. There are courts and systems for that, but investors do have responsibilities if we're connected to a controversy in our portfolio. And invested in large and mid-cap companies, we know we're not holding perfect companies. There are going to be challenges. So we want to understand how do we incentivize that good behavior in business practice with the end result of reducing harm. So the investor rationale, for those of you on the line, I think it's really important we think about the framing, why we think this is important, not only for reducing adverse impacts and causing less harm within companies, but that it has a lot of benefits. I think we heard Jonathan describe this too, that it's an important component of human rights due diligence. It's a tool to strengthen a company's risk management, to reduce litigation and reputational risk, and to serve as an early warning system. When you're getting grievances, you can understand that there's a system that's not working. As Mike went through, it also helps to build trust with employees. When you have a system that's effective, that's being used and being acted upon, people trust it and will use it. It can help repair relationships with stakeholders when harm has occurred. So all of this makes it a priority for investors and companies alike. We want to shift the culture away from kind of hiding the fact that harm occurs to one that's proactive and ready to address it. We worked with experts, civil society, multi-stakeholder initiatives, academics, lawyers who are advising companies, and also rights holders to really hone in on some of those specific behaviors and questions we should be looking for to understand if there's a robust grievance process and remediation strategy. And that's where this concept of remedy readiness comes in. Is a company outside the context of front page news or causing a harm ready to act on the grievances received and provide a remedy? This puts them in a more proactive stance and really thinking about due diligence as risk management. So we're looking for a company that has a clear policy commitment, a human rights policy that acknowledges its responsibility to respect human rights and to remediate if something goes wrong. Train staff with relevant expertise, so people who have human rights background, investigators who will receive those grievances and then be able to act on them. Dedicated resources to do that one-on-one interaction with the person who's lodging a complaint, and then that's well equipped to provide remedy when a harm occurs. And finally, a legitimate process is really rights holder led and rights holder informed. A grievance channel developed in a vacuum will not be used and it will not be effective. So this culture question is really something we've tried to hone in on. Is a company more inclined to deny that they need a grievance channel and says they don't receive any grievances? Or are they more inclined to use this as a process to eliminate the incentives that are leading to harm? So when we see these processes and practices, it helps to orient towards an approach that's delivering outcomes for rights holders. And we have trust that better systems will inform better behaviors and lead to better results. So that's why, and part of what we're looking for is not necessarily evidence. While we are looking for this, we're not necessarily seeing it, evidence of remediation provided, but really that a company has the structures and infrastructure, personnel, resources, and commitment to receive grievances and act on them. None of us are looking to contribute to harm. And I think when we start from that premise that companies can get it right, if they invest in these resources, it puts us all on better footing. It helps a company to demonstrate respect, build trust with employees, the early warning system, and more importantly, a source of continuous learning so that they can fix what goes wrong. So Rebecca mentioned that we have this guide, and there we lift up some of the good practices and key learnings. And I'll just hone in on a few here. The first I mentioned earlier is rights holder design and the grievance mechanism and the design of the remedy to make sure it's appropriate and responsive, and more importantly, is adequate as defined by the rights holder. So there are some cases where we've engaged, a company has said, we investigated, we provided remedy, but in this case of wage theft, the workers didn't ever feel like they had been made whole. So if there's that gap where the company thinks they provided remedy and the rights holder doesn't feel as if they've been made whole, that's what we're looking to close with this rights holder design. Innovative value chain solutions. I saw a question in the chat that so many of the harms occur kind of deep in a company's supply chain. And the conversations we've often had there are, we're just one of many suppliers, or we don't have the leverage, or do you want us to cut and run if there's a harm? And what we really want are companies to develop solutions that are fit for purpose in that supply chain context. So companies working together in the value chain to think about a channel that's accessible to the workers or communities that need it, that can be linked to the company that's sourcing from that location, and that remedy can be collectively provided by companies if that's the appropriate kind of reaction. So we need innovation so that the rights holders and communities impacted can actually get redress. We also want companies to demonstrate that it's a source of continuous learning. So what I mean by that is really doing a root cause analysis that gets to the heart of the business model. Is there a feedback loop between the grievances received and fixes at the company level? That can be really important to show that it's not just kind of a system that's being operated by a third party, disconnected from the human rights team, but in fact has this kind of embedding within a company culture. Some of the key features we want to see, and Mike talked about these too, a commitment to non-retaliation if somebody lodges a complaint, that they won't be exposed to any harm. We want it to be fit for purpose for vulnerable communities, for example, that it's gender sensitive, or if the impacted rights holder is a human rights defender, that they're able to access it and feel comfortable using it. If a company is operating in a high risk and conflict affected context, where negative impacts are more likely to occur, maybe more likely to be severe, that the grievance channel has really contemplated what that should look like and how it needs to be kind of appropriately designed. We also want to see that companies are looking for solutions that work. So we know in a worker context, unions can play a really important role and be a channel for companies to receive and respond to information. We've talked about the effectiveness criteria. I'll really focus on accessibility. The thing we hear most from companies is around language, that the channel is not available in the language that the people that it's designed to reach need, or that it's not culturally appropriate. So there we're thinking about like a disconnect in terms of technology. A place where we're still kind of at our learning edge is around impact. So providing remedy is distinct from a corrective action. A lot of times companies will speak about like, oh, we fixed this audit finding. And of course, like we want them to learn and fix something. But at the end of the day, are they making, like, for example, if it was an incident of child labor, like set up your audit system so you're finding and rooting out the child labor. But at the end of the day, what work has been done to remediate that child that was subjected to child labor? And are you providing that appropriate remedy? So that distinction between corrective action and remediation is something I think companies still really need to build out. Finally, getting to some of the work that Nami spoke about around disclosure, we really need to understand that the grievance channel is being used, that is integrated into human rights due diligence, and that it's effective. At the same time, I acknowledge that the investor community or data providers are more inclined to almost penalize a company for disclosing controversies or harms. And so we need to find a way as a community to really incentivize this learning culture where information is being received and acted on rather than pretending that nothing is going wrong. So in our briefing paper, you'll see some of the disclosure we're looking for, the number and type of grievances, the statuses, the timeline it takes to resolve, trends and patterns that companies are seeing over time. Some of these insights can really help us see that there's an effective grievance channel in place and that it's being used, and that it's being used as a source of rights holder informed human rights due diligence. So I think I'll wrap it up there, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Happy to continue the conversation.
Sure, and thanks, Mary Beth. And I did put a link to the briefing in the chat there, and just really take to heart your point about distinguishing between corrective action plans and actual impact in terms of providing remedy to those who have been harmed. So thank you for those insights from your own engagement experiences with companies. So we have about 6 minutes left, but there are a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to do a little bit of grouping where I can. And Jonathan, I'm actually going to start with you. We had 2 questions in particular that were focused here from Joanna Lee. You mentioned in your presentation that even if a grievance mechanism isn't wholly aligned with the UNGPs 31 effectiveness criteria, it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily effective for stakeholders and rights holders. Can you provide more clarity on the most important criteria that companies should integrate into their grievance mechanisms based on your expertise? And in conjunction with that, there was a question up top, in particular, what indicators or signals should companies look for to know when their mechanism is stagnating rather than evolving? So I'm going to throw that to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I'll be quick, Rebecca, in light of the time. So first, I generally believe that when we look at the guiding principles and we look at the effectiveness criteria, I really think the legitimacy component under 31A, which embodies trust, is going to be the most important of the indicators in my own view. If you don't have trust, you really don't have a mechanism. And a lot of the other indicators, the effectiveness criteria, really are part of trust. Predictability, accessibility, et cetera. So I really think about focusing primarily on trust, and within that, and this gets both to both of the questions, Rebecca. I do think looking at the overall pattern of grievances, so the total number, have those changed over time? What's the demography? Are certain kinds of claims being raised more now than before? Are they coming from certain areas of the business versus what they were before? And what are the reasons for that? So I do think a heavy analysis of the demography of the grievances is really important. But really the most important, in my view, is around anonymity. And so when we think about evolution and growth, are you seeing the number of anonymous grievances go down? You obviously want to offer an anonymous channel, but anonymity is typically a signal of a lack of trust in terms of how the claimant is going to be treated. It does make it challenging for investigation, makes it challenging for remediation. Again, important to have an anonymous mechanism, but if people are using it in a high proportion to other claims, that is a signal of unhealth. And so you really want to see that number go down over time. And if you've kind of hit a plateau in terms of the total number of grievances and the number of anonymous grievances, pretty good indication that you're starting to stagnate.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really appreciate that. So there are a number of questions to you, Mike. I'm trying to quickly scan through these and see if I can pull out some themes. I think one of the things I'm seeing here for sure, oops, and now is that not scrolling? Okay. So one of the questions to you, Mike, is what prompted Lenovo to implement a robust grievance mechanism? Was it something prompted by a commitment to the UNGPs, a response to a particular grievance that was received? I do believe that I'm skimming through here. I saw another question in relation to potentially if you could provide some examples of the type of human rights related grievances you've received, and then a question about the extent to which the Lenovo grievance mechanisms are made available to all supply chain employees, which ties into a question that maybe others want to touch on as well. I believe Mary Beth did a bit in terms of when you're talking about very deep supply chains, 3+ more layers deep, how are you ensuring that employees that far down in the supply chain even understand that this mechanism is at their disposal and that they can use it? And I see we're running out of time, so appreciate if you could maybe provide a concise response, Mike. Sorry, no pressure.
That's okay. I'll try to answer everything I can. Otherwise, I'm happy for anybody to reach out to me as well if they have any additional questions later. So what prompted it? The Investigation Oversight Committee I've been with Lenovo for 3.5 years. Investigation Oversight Committee was already here. But then about 2 years ago, we noticed that there were certain locations we weren't receiving grievances from that we should be, particularly on our employee numbers, in particular from our manufacturing workers. And we noticed that the tool and the mechanism we had at the time wasn't the best for it. It wasn't available in all languages. It wasn't it wasn't accessible in some regions. There wasn't a local phone number. So we went out to go and look for a better one. So me and my team started on that process, and this is where we identified the tool Wisply. And then Wisply is a third-party provider, but we manage the system internally. And so we did that because it's best fit for us, where it's available in all languages, so we can receive any type of concern from inappropriate conduct all the way up to human rights or bribery and corruption and so on. And we receive everything through there. Sorry, Rebecca. I'm just trying to think of what the other questions were, and I'll try to get through them.
Yeah, I think one was in relation to the types of human rights related grievances that you've been receiving. Are there some trends or patterns that you could speak to?
Yeah, so we receive allegations for everything from a human rights perspective, the ones that I can call, we receive them. Now, just to caveat here, just because we receive an allegation concern, that doesn't mean that's what happened or that was substantiated. I don't want to go into any specific case details, but we receive cases related to human rights, such as, forced labor, payments and overtime, or conditions of workers, things like that. And they would be the ones that would fall under our human rights category that we would receive.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. I know there are other questions here for the other speakers as well that we've not been able to answer. So what I'd like to propose is we're going to be sharing out these slides. We'll share out the recording. We'll go ahead and gather these questions where there are particular speakers that they are addressed to. We'll either provide you a reference to some of the resources where that question might be answered, and or reach out to, if it's okay with you guys, to the speakers to see if they might have a concise response that they can provide, because we don't want to let these questions go unanswered. I know a number of our speakers have already provided their emails for direct outreach. Appreciate that as well. And just want to thank again all of you for your interventions today. This was really informative, from the theoretical in terms of what's in the UNGPs to the very practical of how to turn this into action at the company level, and how investors can understand how these processes are assessed, to how they can effectively engage with companies and what they can expect. So really grateful to all of you. And thank you, and thanks everyone for attending, and have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.